We actually have an awesome panel. I'm going to start on the end with Jeanne. Could you just introduce yourself and kind of tell us a little bit about, and we'll go down the row here with everybody else.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Jeanne Lien. I'm from College of DuPage. I'm the program manager at International Trade Center. What we do there is we help U.S. exporter to get export ready and to make market interest. And my background in my previous life was in international sales. So I have market experience in Asia, Europe, and Middle East. For Eastern Europe region, my focus was on Russia and Ukraine, by also overseeing the sales activity in other Eastern Europe countries.
Thank you. Okay.
I'm Bob Faber, and my wife and I actually live in Bulgaria, and we're here in the States for a little while. I spent about 15 years in Silicon Valley, and then moved over to Bulgaria as a teacher, then used my business background to start a company and wound up starting a few companies there and working with a lot of others, providing consulting for them. And so my experience in Eastern Europe is really more of a practical one.
Can I just ask, I get Silicon Valley, but I don't get the Bulgaria. Why? Was there a family or a relative tie? Or?
Well, when I was in graduate school, I actually met some Bulgarians, and it is true that Balkan people are incredibly warm. Fell in love with them and decided, we would move over there to help them.
Cool. Derek?
Sure. So I'm Derek Begue with PRA Global. My firm is an international business development company. We provide services to the often forgotten middle markets, so too big to take advantage of SBA and SME type support, but not large enough to play with some of the big boys or take advantage of the larger incentives that some of the countries offer. And our business is trying to make those organizations successful with market entry and implementation services. I actually have an international business degree and have a bit more of a focus on East Asia. However, I'm our VP of Business Development, and a number of our clients are active in Eastern Europe, or we're headquartered out of Eastern Europe in Poland and Warsaw, and I'm on our senior leadership team that tries to manage our own business. So we're a practitioner as well as a service provider, helping mostly manufacturers succeed in international markets.
Excellent. And I'm Richard Paullin. I'm the petite fonctionnaire here. I run the International Trade Association of Greater Chicago. As I say, I'm going to try to stay out of the way. So, Jeanne, can you tell us a little bit about doing business in Eastern Europe? What are the challenges?
I would say the biggest challenge, of course, is the political instability. The second thing I can see is the slow business process. And the third thing, I would say, well, it really depends on industry, but from where I came from, biggest challenge to me is how to build a after-sales service network locally to support the business over there. So starting from the first one, I mean, we all know about Russia sanction. So that actually hit me really bad when it's back to 2014 and 15. I remember my sales, particularly in Russia, dropped at least 30%. So that year was rough. And another thing is not just internationally, but also domestic-wise, the election plays a very important role to this country. So the buyers, if you're actually trying to close deal like before election or right after election, well, good luck to that, because a lot of buyers, they will tend to postpone the order, or they'll actually hold it until they can foresee what's the future is coming. And the second challenge I mentioned is the slow business process. For this country, I think they are still very bureaucratic, and their hierarchy is also contribute the whole slow process. So, and they really take their time to make decisions. But don't get me wrong, most of the buyers from this country are really hard worker, and they really keen to learn. But it just sometimes that you will feel like the things are dragging, especially if there is any government agency or bank involved. And the third challenge is, I think that's a challenge to a lot of exporter if you're trying to go to a new market. The question you will be asked is how are you going to support me? For Eastern Europe, I think the challenge is the transportation normally takes longer if you don't have local presence. So I think that's something, for my case, before we build a warehouse in Eastern Europe, what we do is we normally flew our engineer there to train the people over there, and we normally actually help them to prepare like extra spare parts just in case they need support. And the web conference and to work around their clock is pretty normal. You just need to be there to support them, because I want to say a lot of companies there are still at the learning curve. Mm-hmm. So that's the 3 questions I think are the more important ones.
Thank you. Bob, what about the challenges from your perspective?
I'm going to address this from a little bit different point of view as a business operator. The biggest challenge in Bulgaria is capital shortage. I mean, not just in terms of investment capital, but working capital. And this, I think, also speaks to the comments earlier from the Small Business Administration. Someone wants credit terms, so there were some other discussions about that. You know, this is a huge thing that gets in the way of business in Bulgaria in particular, because they're always worried about where the cash is going to come from, just to pay the salaries for people during the month, to keep their business open for the next month. Second one is skills deficiencies. And the reason why it's a challenge is because it's not monolithic in terms of a certain set of skills that are absent. Most individuals have some skills that they're really good at and others that are completely absent from their portfolio, because they have experiences that don't fill all the gaps. And that is a big challenge, because they don't want to be embarrassed, so they're not going to tell you. And unless you investigate and find out, you're only going to find out when they can't do the job that you've hired them to do. And that piece comes up that's missing. So that's something that's I think a big deal, and it has been for every businessman that I've worked with in Bulgaria. And third thing is personal ownership. I think the influence of the communist era is still very strong in Bulgaria, and that's strong still in the sort of rising generation as it is in sort of my age group and the older generation, because it's the older generations that are advising the younger generations, and the younger generations are coming up with the same kinds of fears and worries that their parents and grandparents had, and so the typical approach to work is, what am I getting? And what am I getting? They don't really think about the company, and that's actually seen in the way they talk about salary. When we spoke earlier about the income, 250 euros is the minimum salary. 250 euros is the salary that they get in their pocket. It's not what includes all of Social Security and all of the insurance and taxes and everything else. So all those numbers, they don't matter. That's for the company to worry about. What matters to me as an employee is what goes in my pocket. And so that's still hard to overcome. I've had lots of opportunities to try to work with incentive plans and benefit packages and different sorts of means to encourage people and incentivize them to do more or to attack opportunities more aggressively, maybe. And it is very difficult to get those sorts of things to work.
There used to be an old saying in Russia that we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us.
Yes. Yeah.
Still sort of the same mentality. That's too bad. Derek?
Sure, I think what intrigued me by your statement, Bob, was the what am I getting, and it's not necessarily just monetary. It also happens to be maybe job portfolio, and that goes to hierarchy. Mm-hmm. Decisions come from top down. That's somewhat of the culture. And as in my business, we have many small businesses around the world, a head count about 5 in Eastern Europe, and we have offices in China and India. And our clients are trying to grow, but managed growth because of lack of human capital, lack of financial capital, and those are also smaller operations. Well, it's really hard to run and grow a small operation without initiative, and when you have bottlenecks. So when even in our business where we struggle and where it's hard for some of our clients to grow, it's that portfolio of the individual and initiative. If you're not telling them the specific items that they need to accomplish and then continuing to follow up, it might seem like it's a lack of accountability when really it's just what they're used to doing, and your own people can be your own barriers to some degree. Which is a core challenge when you're trying to scale. And I think when we talk about middle market manufacturing or even service businesses, and what my company tries to do, it's scaling to multiple millions of dollars of sales, and that is the really difficult challenging piece of it. Because if you don't have teams of 10, 15, 20 with specialized roles, then you have to have skill sets that are very broad, maybe not as deep, but very broad. And as Bob said, sometimes you have very specific trained skills, but perhaps you don't have some of the other soft skills as well. I think another challenge that we can see is unemployment rates are pretty low across parts of Eastern Europe. I think Czech's 2.4%, Poland's 4.5%, particularly in manufacturing, and it's labor availability is a struggle, and but not only labor availability, but productivity in manufacturing. It's a lot different in these countries than in, say, Germany. Now, you have a lower cost of operations, but are you getting the same amount of parts out? Are you getting the same amount of productivity out? And that's something you gotta balance as you're trying to plan and grow your business. So I would say those are some challenges that really anyone trying to operate or trying to grow or even trying to sell and grow exports has to work through, because those distributors and those partners you're working with are going to face some of those challenges.
My sense is that there's enormous variability from one country to the next in terms of all the things we've been talking about. I'm thinking in particular, last year we hosted a group from the American Chamber of Commerce in Slovenia. And they were incredibly well organized. They had some very bright people in the group. Some of them already had operations in the United States, though not in Chicago. And I was completely blown away by it. It wasn't what I was expecting. And just from what I've heard here today, I sense that there's a lot of variability in this chunk of geography that we're calling Eastern Europe. Is that a valid observation? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Very.
Yeah. Well, when Slovenia was the first of the Yugoslavian republics to break away, and there was barely a whisper about it. No one stopped them, no one objected, no one did anything. And when Tudjman, who was the president of Croatia at the time, was asked this question, why didn't anyone complain? He said, they were never one of us anyway. Because they were so much like Western Europe in their mindset. Culturally, they're just different. But it does speak to the wide variation in the region, in these different populations. Because you have different smaller countries, and then within those countries, you have minorities that overlap from other countries or from third countries, which create, all kinds of different social situations and cultural situations you need to deal with in the business sphere that are not immediately obvious.
Well, I was thinking of that during the keynote presentation when you were talking about risk and how the U.S. is in general is willing to accept a lot of risk. But that's true. This is my experience. That's true on the West Coast, in Silicon Valley. It is not true in the Midwest at all. If you go bankrupt in the Midwest, people say that's too bad and never talk to you again. If you go belly up in Silicon Valley, people say, well, that's too bad. What are you going to do next? It's even within a country is all I'm saying. is that the differences can be vast. Well, okay, so we have this set of challenges. How do you get around them? How do you still manage to do business? What's the workaround?
Well, to keep it short, 3 tips I will give you guys is be patient, be flexible, and use your connection wisely. Because I think our keynote speaker just mentioned earlier, like Russian and Ukrainian, they love relationship. So everything is actually relation-based. So if you have somebody they already trust to introduce you to this buyer, they tend to believe you are also trustworthy. And it actually makes the relationship building and the business negotiation a little bit smoother. And so the reason why you have to be patient, of course, is it takes time for you to really build the relationship. A lot of people from this country, the first thing you will notice is they all look so serious. I remember when I started doing this market, I was in my early 20s. So I met one Russian buyer. He was big. And I was so terrified. I was like, oh my God, you're gonna be kidding me. That was my first trade show. But as we warmed up, and it turns out he is really friendly. And of course, their relationship not only just grow like business-wise, actually grow like personally. So he's still a dear friend of mine at this point. So I would say like be patient, and as I mentioned before, the business process tend to be a little bit dragging. And okay, there's no official here, so I'm allowed to say this. Don't be surprised that corruption and bribery still happen in that region. As an exporter, I don't have to personally deal with that, but I've heard that multiple times that my importer, they need to pay up something to speed things up a little bit. So, and that's why I say be patient. Oh, and of course the other thing is the decisions is made from the top down. So you find it the same thing you're working with, say, different country, like for example, like Western Europe country. It probably takes you a month to close a deal, but when it comes to Eastern Europe, the time normally like goes double. And it's really hard to get feedback from them like in between. But the thing is, you still need to follow up. But the tricky point is you need to follow up, but you can't do it too frequently. Otherwise, you will be considered too pushy, too rude. That's the tricky part. And be flexible. Of course, a lot of buyers, they will ask for credit term, ask for better payment term. So, and they are not afraid to negotiate. They're like top negotiator. They really try to get a rock bottom price of yours. So you really need to reserve a room for you to protect your margin. And for the credit term, and you need to know what's the resources out there. For example, the gentleman here earlier from Exim Bank, the insurance is actually a good start for you just to work with this buyer since they ask for the credit so often. And yeah, that's pretty much.
Well, that's pretty good advice, though, for doing business almost anywhere, I think.
Oh, I want to address one thing, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If you're going to do business with people from this country, be prepared to drink, because alcohol is really something gonna happen. Really, like I have a colleague that we went to visit a customer in Europe. I remember the first night, he's so drunk and he's puke in his room. So I had to rescue him from that mess. Yeah, so be prepared for that.
All right.
Okay, well, well, I made my notes of my 3 best practices, and the first one is patience. Everything takes longer. So just exactly, echoing what you had to say. Just every process is slower, and we as Americans are not used to that. And we run into this with government offices all the time. One of our companies is a relocation specialist, and so we help people process their visa requests and residence permits. And Americans will go to the consulate and they'll give their application in, and then they want an answer. And they don't realize that it actually takes time for all of these things to happen. And they'll call and say, well, why isn't the answer back yet? And a Bulgarian doesn't want to tell you, well, I don't know, or there's no reason. So they'll think of if you ask them enough, the way they'll get you off their back is they'll just give you another thing to do. And when you apply for a visa, there are about 12 documents that you have to have if you want to move to Bulgaria. But there's another 40 documents that are not required, but could be asked for in the event they wanted to investigate something further. All right? So you have to be careful not to be pushy, because if you're pushy, you bring problems upon yourself that you don't need to be asking for, and they don't really want to give you. But they're just trying to calm you down. And so if you're agitated because you feel like progress isn't moving, they'll say, well, here's the reason why progress isn't moving, because you have to give me this. And they'll send you off on this task to go do that and bring it to them. So patience is very important. A second thing is you have to really be willing to invest in training. Even if some of our customers have been companies doing 1 or 2 year contracts on export and installation of equipment that would be in the Bulgarian infrastructure. But they spend an inordinately large amount of time training because they need to make sure that the Bulgarians can take care of it after they go. And for us, as an operating company in Bulgaria, it's the same thing. You know, I spend much more time on individual training than I ever did in America or any other country that I've worked in, for that matter. But you know, it's not without result. I have found that the Bulgarians they like to learn, they're willing to learn, and they will take the time to master the skill. You know, I had one guy in particular called Mitko, who was a translator and real people person, and did group work in teams, but wasn't very detail-oriented, didn't spend a lot of time behind a computer, but came into a management role where he needed to run financial models. You know, he was frightened to do that. But once we were able to get him started, and I sent him to a course, and then I sat down with him, I met with him every week for several months to go over spreadsheets, to talk about models, and literally worked individually with him until he gained the confidence to be able to do it himself. And now he just does it. And so there's no problem in learning or mastering, but getting started is often an issue. So they need encouragement. Third thing is relationships. And I don't mean networking, because networking is a uniquely Western thing that basically doesn't really work in Eastern Europe. It'll work on the surface, but it doesn't really get you what you want. I'm talking about deeper relationships require a lot of investment in time and getting to know someone and showing them that you're really out for their best interest, and that can only be done with time.
Yeah.
So I have a few stories, or maybe just two. Maybe another story after we get to another question. But we have one client that is setting up a manufacturing facility in Poland, in south of Poland, for automotive, and they lost sight a bit of their own internal ability to control their process, and they were viewing a developer as essentially a vendor and not really a partner in what they were trying to do. And they caused confusion themselves, which things take a little bit more time. You gotta be patient. Don't ask them and ask them and ask them and get more stuff to do that wasn't required. And of course, setting up a facility requires government incentives, it requires permitting, it requires environmental. It's not an uncomplicated process. So if the American company, or I guess wherever the company is, can control their own confusion, then they're going to have an easier time working with things that could and will go wrong in one of those areas. So that's one story. The other story being somewhat related to training, where it's a project we have more on the sales development side. And besides a small problem when a direct employee that we're hosting for a client He has a DUI and cannot drive now in anywhere else besides Poland, causing a problem because he has to cover the entire area. Apparently, he was trying to sell really hard to somebody and overdrank. That can happen, clearly. For that purposes, you got to expect the unexpected. I don't think anyone expected that to happen, and the budget had to grow a little bit for rental cars, etc. And that individual as well, in that type of culture, I think in the U.S., there's a hunting sales culture. You're going to go out, you're going to kind of eat what you kill type of environment. That doesn't really exist over there to a certain degree. It's much more relationship based. They're going to do a trade shows, and they're going to do the follow up. Well, things weren't going fast enough, and they weren't following up as progressively as they could. And it wasn't that they didn't have the skills, it was they didn't have the encouragement and the direct management or the self-starter kind of gene that was required to get it off the ground. So the manager at our client wasn't providing him what he needed to be successful in that area, particularly with people outside of his own culture, which again, a lot of different variability. And the biggest market was Germany, and this was a Polish gentleman, and it became difficult even with two countries that close in geography. So not only patience, but also the training, and then providing what the employee might need, but he's not going to tell you what he needs, and a rental car.
It's a rental car. Mm-hmm. Oh, ouch. The thread of patience runs through all of this. And just as a general observation on how the world works, American companies, and the chart that was up here at lunch, where individuals and we're out there, American companies are famous for not doing their research before they go abroad. It's what we used to call the ready, fire, aim principle. That they would, and large and small companies, I mean, we're talking Pillsbury going into the Japanese market with a cake mix that they thought the Japanese housewife would cook up in her rice cooker. Never mind that for 3,000 years a rice cooker has only cooked rice. And that turned out to be a disastrously expensive experiment. And you've lived in Japan, you know. You get 5 housewives together and you ask them, would you buy this? And they all say no. That's how the rest of the country is going to behave. You can do a focus group with 5 Japanese and pretty much have it. So Ameritech used to be a big phone company here. They went off to China 20 years ago. Put an office in Beijing. Took them 2 years to close it because they didn't know what they were doing. They just thought they should have an office in Beijing. Everybody else was. So the cautionary tale is don't fall into the ready, fire, aim syndrome and go charging off without a plan and without doing your research, because that's what really, really, really hurts. I guess we can entertain questions and from the audience. Mm-hmm. Sir?
Hi, Colin Murphy with Simmons Knife and Saw. We're a small manufacturer located in Glendale Heights. So Jeanne, you had brought up corruption and said you didn't have to deal with it too much since you were just selling into the countries. But I'm curious, for the other two gentlemen, you might be faced with it more readily, particularly Bob. Mm-hmm. Have you come face to face with it, and then how have you dealt with that?
So there are two things that Americans call corruption that are viewed in distinctly different fashions certainly in Eastern Europe, and I think in most of the world. One is an outright bribe, where you pay someone to do something illegal, like circumvent the bid process or overlook a certification that you require or some other breaking of the law. That's clearly illegal. That goes on all the time in Bulgaria, but not as much as another kind of corruption, which is we would call grease money, which is when you just pay someone to do their job. And that is something that is prevalent in these societies and is really just a part of the governing process. Americans get very upset about this. a good example is when you go to a government office and you need something processed. In Bulgaria, in a lot of offices, there's a scale. And for example, if you pay $50, you can get it done in a week. And if you pay $100, you can get it done in 3 days. If you want it done today, you pay $200. And everybody knows, none of it's written down, but everybody knows how much you have to pay and who you have to pay. And they all share in the office. It's not like one person is taking all the money. One person collects the money, and then they share it. It's like shared tips. So there's a lot of that goes on. And then there's another form of that is giving a piece of whatever you're doing to the officials involved. That's very common. The idea that 10% is given to a government official is just understood in Bulgarian business.
So it sounds like we just write it down when Postal Service comes. You want to do it express, 10 days, 3 days. You just write it down, it's not corruption.
It's actually true. A lot of these things, I think in America, started out the same way that they are in that part of the world, where they were informal and coercive. And now we've just codified it by making it a part of the structure.
Sure.
Johnny?
Well, how can one counter that?
I'm sorry?
How can one counter that? How can one do business in a situation like that?
Well, I can tell you that you have to be firm whatever you decide to do, because if you do it once, everyone will know what you did. So that's one thing for sure. Grease money, you have to just be willing to pay it. I mean, if you're not willing to pay it, you can't do business in these countries. I mean, and it's not illegal. Even in Bulgaria, it's actually not illegal. It's written into the code where you can pay people up to a certain amount. It's just sort of like the maximum gift laws in America that exist in a lot of places. So you need to think of it that way in terms of these little amounts of money you pay people to do their job. For bribes, we don't give bribes, and it has cost us business. We simply walk away. Most people, I have to tell you, most people do not. We've lost a significant amount of business because we won't do it.
20 some years ago, when Vietnam opened up for American companies, I ran across an attorney who was actually based in Hong Kong, but she's an American lady. She opened an office in Hanoi, and one of the first American attorneys in Vietnam. And the same question came to her, what do you do? And she said, you never give any money for a bribe, because once you do, everybody will have their hand out, and you're absolutely screwed. But she also left within 3 years, because the Vietnamese police were harassing her. They'd show up at her house at all hours of the day and night, and they can make life very uncomfortable. And she said, I'm done, man.
Yeah.
Too difficult.
Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
This is going to be a terrible observation, but what you've described doesn't sound that much different than what goes on in the city of Chicago.
Oh, no.
But there are situations, and I guess my question is, I know in some nations, and I was wondering if these Eastern European venues, a government official, say a harbor master or something, is not given a salary and is expected to live off the grease money that they receive. Is that the situation there, or something similar to that?
I don't know about in every country, but in Bulgaria, that is certainly the case. And I know that it's also true in Macedonia and in Greece, which are other countries that we work in. I mean, the public civil servant salaries are very low, and it is assumed that they're going to be taking tips. And so it's very much the way the way I explain it to people who are starting a business. I always tell them, you have to count on this like it's exactly like running a restaurant in America, where you expect some of your employees are going to collect tips, and how you're going to organize the sharing of the tips and everything else that you do is the same situation.
Good analogy.
Yeah, very good analogy. What was I going to say? Other questions?
I've got a question.
Yes, please.
You haven't talked about the price, the cost or price of full employment versus partial employment. That seems to me to be an issue that's variable in Eastern Europe as well. If someone's fully employed with benefits versus someone who's not. I didn't know if that was something that you wanted to mention or talk about.
From our perspective, you look at the model, especially if you're setting up a larger operation or even if it's a smaller operation, you kind of bake that into your plan. Are you looking at having part-time employees versus full-time employees? What are those costs? Is there an opportunity cost for what you're trying to do? So in our business, we're really involved in the business planning and implementation of what we're doing with clients. So we actually say, all right, what's the head count for what you're trying to do? If it's $2 million in revenue, then you probably need these employees for service or technical support as well as finance and logistics. Maybe you don't need a full-time person for logistics. Maybe it's a half-time person for logistics. Therefore, what are the rules and regulations for part-time workers and the benefits associated with those types of workers? So certainly in different countries, there are some benefits. And if you want to use contractors, that can get even more gray. And in some ways, if you are using what we considered a 1099 here in the U.S., right? So in the U.S., it's pretty liberalized. In other countries, if they don't have other work, they might still be considered a direct employee, and they still need benefits from your company. So as you work through how you're going to put a localized footprint or localized support on the ground, you have to think that all these different jurisdictions are going to have different ways of looking, not only at what's acceptable from an employer-employee perspective, but what the liability is for the employer or even the foreign company that is paying these individuals, and how they might be treated by the government.
Yeah, that's a very good comment, because there is cost associated to having contractors, at least in Bulgaria, that is not insignificant as compared to in America. I mean, you have to pay a certain number of taxes for them, regardless of whether they're an employee. Yeah.
Now, are there also laws that make it very difficult to let someone go? In other words, in Central America, and a few years back when I was doing some work there, if someone had worked for you for 365 days, then if you wanted to let them go, you had to give them 3 months notice and 6 months of severance, and I mean, it got really cumbersome.
I think that, I think that the countries that are mostly aspiring to be EU members are very rapidly try to conform to a Western understanding. Yeah. And in Bulgaria, there's this huge divide in the sort of employment ranks between those who have contracts that you would call contracts with seniority benefits, which lead to these sorts of issues, and other ones that are at-will contracts or timed contracts that expire and then need to be renewed. And both of them have their pluses and minuses and lead to different situations that could be problems down the road. But there is a mix, and you do need to be careful about which ones you sign with your employees. Yep. There's also the hourly versus salaried issue, which is a big issue. Travel workers, Bulgaria still has per diem laws. If you send someone outside of their municipality where they live, you must pay them a daily per diem. So I mean, there are different sorts of rules that increase business costs that you may not think about until they happen, because we don't have them here.
And the EU being harmonized doesn't mean there aren't any differences. Right. If you look at France's unemployment rate, which is really high, partially it's because of the way they've structured the labor market. I know specifically in Poland, there's a 3-month trial period that you reach to a certain point before you start accruing some of those benefits. It's harder in France to get rid of an older employee, but that doesn't leave any room for the younger generation to have stable employment over a period of time, which is causing a lot of the issues in that labor market. So there are going to be differences per country. So you really do have to do your homework in each case, particularly when you're trying to compare where you should locate. When we were looking at different locations for our clients, Czech Republic, Poland, Slovakia, those are very different in terms of how you deploy the labor model in particular.
Is union issue to be aware of, labor union, in any of those countries still?
I don't know about issue,
Manufacturing.
not so
Labor
much
union.
in Eastern Europe. I don't believe the unions are as strong. Clearly in Germany and France, they're very, very powerful. And they can afford it a little bit because of the productivity of the labor force. I think there was just a strike that ended in Germany not too long ago. But that's not as prevalent in Eastern Europe from my experience.
Yeah. I don't know, in my experience in Bulgaria, the unions that are strong are the professional unions, which basically just throw up barriers to entry so that competitors can't get in. But once someone is in that field, then they're just part of it.
Thank you.
Speaking of corruption in Chicago, do we have corruption in Chicago? It's sort of incumbent on me, I think, in any conversation about bribery and foreign, to talk about the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, because that's really what American companies are scared of. And it's nothing to do with the grease that you're talking about. It's to do with the bribe to get around, to get to the contract, to get government services, to get whatever. Just as a little perspective, back in the act came about back in the 80s when there was a aircraft manufacturer called Lockheed, which I'm sure nobody's heard about, and they were trying to get a contract to sell planes to All Nippon Airways, ANA, and they had their intermediary pull up to the Prime Minister's residence, which would be like the White House, with 2 boxes of cash and leave it at the front door. I mean, that's basically what they did. And the US Congress found out about this and was shocked that an American company would behave that way. And hence we got the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. It has been revised and refined a little bit because it used to be, in the original version, that you could not pay the grease to get your passport back, for example, at customs control, which left a lot of American companies in a lot of travelers in a real fix. But, and in point of fact, it's taken kind of the rest of the world 30 years to catch up with us, but the OECD countries now have a pact, an anti-corruption pact, and it's still not a level playing field, but the penalties for violating it are really serious now. It's both to the individual who at the company and the company. And if you're in, it's like $100,000 and 5 years in jail, and the company cannot pay you for it. So the government's serious about it. It has been for a long time. And I don't know, there are some of us that think that this is what America stands for, and it's a really good thing, that we're setting an example for the rest of the world. That's my take on it anyway.
Professor Bill Cressy, and I teach that.
Well.
And in fact, the example I
Preaching
gave,
to the converted.
after it was first passed, there were situations where American flag ships would pull into a harbor, and they would say, hey, we can't pay the bribes anymore. And they say, okay, well, your ship can stay there because we're not going to unload it, until you pay, And so it was eased. But that law also requires companies to document their internal control so that ignorance is no excuse. It's either you knew your agent was paying a bribe or you should have known because you should have had good internal controls in there. And as you say, the penalties are quite hefty on that.
Yeah. We've used this actually as a defense against requests for bribes. Especially in dealing with Western companies, because if we're representing or working with a large foreign company that's bringing workers or investment to Bulgaria, we can just say, look, you don't understand, if I do this, even if it's in your country, they're going to put me in prison in America, which is actually true.
Yeah.
And of course, Bulgarians don't believe that at first blush, because they're like, they're not going to come and get you here. But actually, that's the American government actually does. And, once they realize that that's true, it does give you a sort of insulation against the pressure. And then it becomes a question of whether they really want the deal. And in more cases than not, they really want the deal.
But I am constantly surprised. In a different life, I was with a bunch of livestock exporters the other day, and they were talking about, selling horses to Pakistan or something, and how, well, they knew their agent was probably paying a little something to get the horses across the border, but no problem. And I said, geez, have you not heard of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act? Oh, what's that? I go, Jesus, guys, you might do a little research.
That and
But-
ITAR.
Yeah, let's not even go there. But yes, you had a question.
Maybe you are not surprised that I will say something. I hope you will take it with a sense of humor. My personal experience from living in 7 countries with, let's say, working experience of more than 25 years, and also living in Bulgaria, so I have experience there and working only for the private sector. I can tell you one basic thing. The corruption in Bulgaria, what you call corruption, is absolutely the same everywhere in the world. There is no difference, and this is not excuse. If it was so, there won't be so many hundreds of American investors in Bulgaria. This is it. But I want to ask something different, if you allow me.
Yeah.
What I have as a case usually is sometimes difference or inability of the two sides to understand each other. And I'm speaking basically for the American business culture and what is the culture in Europe. Or let's say the culture between Europe and Orient, because we are a little bit mixture from the both. Usually, whoever goes in Bulgaria or any of our countries tries to put respective management, the values of the company, and the way how they did it in America. Usually, they think is the best way how to do it in our countries. This never works, and I always explain, please have in mind that you're in a different country. Most probably it's a good idea if you have a local management, for example, who is going to sell your things or make your investment or whatever. And after usually a year of totally, let's say, lost, they are changing their behavior, then they succeed. Do you think that whoever goes in these countries, Eastern countries, should first consider this entering on the market, or this is usually how it goes with the investors? They learn from their bad experience. And who actually advised the American companies that are going there? Is there something that is called a consultants or whoever is doing this?
Most Americans get advice from Americans, and that doesn't actually help the situation. And I think from our perspective at my firm, we see a lot of people try to use expats, and that's a half measure in marrying the trust in their own people and their own organization and the way they want people to behave. But just relying on the expat is almost a losing battle, and to some degree, one, they're very expensive, and you can pay a lot for just one expat in Hong Kong that's managing an entire region. And you can never get better results unless maybe in China where a white face opens doors. But generally, a nationalized citizen knows how to do their own job better than somebody from a different culture coming in for 5, 6, 10 years. And I think many of the American companies tend to lean more toward the arrogant side of, well, I'm just going to make it work. Well, sometimes that doesn't end up working in a time enough for your superiors to think is enough time, going back to kind of the results-oriented type of culture. my perspective.
And I think that's universal. I think that's not just American companies. I used to know a lot of Japanese in the Chicagoland area who constantly complained about the head office not understanding how the United States works, and vice versa, as they say. A friend of mine was the head of Mellon Bank in Tokyo, and his head office didn't understand that the Ministry of Finance in Japan required him to file, hundreds of pages a week of accounting and financial reporting and all kinds of stuff. And he couldn't get his head office to understand that this was a requirement of having an office in Tokyo. So I think it goes both ways. Somebody who's done this before, your practice should always be to adopt sort of a humble posture when you're entering another country, and keep your mouth shut and your eyes open. But easier said than done. You had a question, sir?
Yes, I do. Before coming stateside, I explored going to Eastern Europe, for education, specifically Czech Republic and Bulgaria, because I was interested in medical field. And I remember in Czech Republic, there was a Charles University, and I think they were about the only university that had their language of instruction was in English. So could you shed more light on that? Because I have relatives who are interested. And Charles Republic had a very good medical school, I understand. The school was about 500 years old, and people went there from different parts of the world, and you could leave high school and go straight into their medical school, unlike the American system, which you have to obtain almost a first degree.
I'm not sure what the question is. I'm
The
sorry.
question is, can you shed more light on schools in that region, Eastern Europe, which have programs in English?
Well, I can tell you that in Bulgaria, there are English language programs at most universities, but they are the exception, not the rule. The only English language instruction, fully English language instruction school is actually the American University in Bulgaria.
And how expensive is that?
I'm sorry?
How expensive is that school?
It's less than an American school, but more than a European school.
Okay. More than an Eastern European school?
Yes. But for example, the medical academy in Sofia has a English language program for foreign students where they take some couple of dozen students every year and they run that whole program in English. So there are isolated programs that are actually quite good, high quality, within the university structure, but not an entire institution where the program is taught in English. So there are opportunities. I don't know all of the different fields, but in most, I am involved in higher education in Bulgaria, and I do know that all the schools that we work with have some English language possibilities, but they're not the dominant language.
And are they open to foreigners studying?
Sure. All Bulgarian
medical-
universities are open to foreigners.
Because I know there's some countries that will not allow foreigners study. Maybe
Yeah, no,
like in
Bulgaria is very
Bulgaria.
open to foreigners.
If you
foreign
need any
students.
information for this, I can provide you if you're interested in specific field or specific university or whatever.
All right, good.
And when they need to move there, we'll help them.
There you go. There you go.
Would I be able to make a comment on global teams? Global teams? I've lived in Bulgaria now 18 years, privileged to be the wife of Bob and watched him. I'm an academic myself, not a business person. But I agree very much with our Bulgarian lady that a native or a national will have incredible fruitfulness in their relationships, particularly locally, and in understanding customs, and in helping to give and bring insights that a foreigner would take years to acquire. But I'd like to make a plug for the creativity and innovation and the positive attitude that adding outsiders in to an insider group. So if you end up with a homogeneous teams of management or employees, you end up, in my view, my opinion, weaker. Whereas if you're able to suffer through the cultural dynamics of varieties of cultures on a team, you end up, in my view, innately stronger. So that would mean mixing Americans, Germans, Brits, Bulgarians on a Bulgarian national team. That's just my opinion.
Well, if you look at some of the best managed multinational corporations, that's exactly what they do. But for those of us unwashed, the smaller companies don't always have that luxury. And that's just the fact of the matter, I'm afraid. Sir?
Yes. I had experiences with the multinational corporations and also international expat. In German company, Asian background for American customers. So in the cases, I think it's, as Richard, you mentioned that, I think it's more universal cases. But I want to focus on, for the better global management, I think the managing the human resources workforce is more focused on the functions. For example, if we deal with the sales and the marketing, those stuffs, we better use local managers. But sometimes the global company needs some control financially. That case is that they're gonna sending their headquarter people to other countries. And also, IT side, also they're gonna send it, because this is all managed globally as a standard in terms of the standard of the corporate systems. So I think it's more depends on the functions
That's a good point.
global corporations.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, functions are very important. In my experience of observing and working with companies, the companies that know that all sides bring advantages and are out to exploit the advantages of both the local people and the things that they bring with their company culture are the ones that tend to be more successful. Even to the point of, in several instances, I know of companies that brought a foreigner in for the specific purpose of building relationships with nationals so that they can put a national team in charge. And that's actually what we do. What we've done in, we have 5 organizations that we've started in Bulgaria, and 4 of them are run by Bulgarians entirely now. But it took us a lot of years to learn the language, get to know people, and invest a length of time that is unusual for Americans.
Very. Yes?
Yeah, I'm just curious whether there's been a brain drain in some of these countries that are now part of the EU, like Bulgaria.
Aside from in the IT field, where there are good opportunities in Bulgaria, basically because you can work from anywhere, there's a tremendous brain drain. It's really sad. It's for the enrichment of the world, because Bulgarians are hardworking and intelligent and ambitious. So bully for the rest of the world, and it's really sad for Bulgaria because they're losing young people.
The impression I get is when Western Europe was developing over 20, 25 years, most Eastern Europes would emigrate to those countries where there were opportunity, their jobs. If you think about the UK, Brexit aside now, there's a large Polish community. I think one of our managing directors often jokes that he can go in Chicago too, maybe a lot longer ago, but he can find a large sector of the Polish community that's doing the middle manager jobs, because they're not looking for the really high-paying jobs, and they have enough skill and hard work, and they'll accept maybe lower pay and operate in that part of the economy. And that's almost a whole generation of people. And now, since we're seeing much more investment, new investment going into Eastern Europe, because saturated markets in Western Europe, some of them are coming back. Sometimes the kids are coming back, but some of them have already built their lives in these other markets. So clearly that's an issue that is going to be created.
Are these countries doing anything to stem that brain drain?
Well, I think in Bulgaria, I'm encouraged. We've seen a real shift in the national thinking. When we first arrived, the biggest question people asked me was, how do we keep our young people from leaving? And now, much more frequently, I hear, what can we do so our young people want to stay? Yeah, subtle difference, but very meaningful. Because now people realize, once people who hadn't traveled before go overseas and they see the opportunity, they're like, oh, now I know why they're leaving. If I were them, I'd be going too. And then they go home and say, okay, what am I going to do to make it better? And I think that that's becoming more common in Bulgaria, certainly among the ruling class. They're trying to keep the talent in the country.
I want to say that actually happened around the world because I'm coming from Taiwan. It's also an Asian country. So what happened is people come to foreign country to study and they don't want to leave because there's a better job, better chances here. So, but taking American as an example, it's not really like for everybody to stay. There's like visa, immigrant rule you need to follow. But for some people that are not be able to stay, they go back to the country to start thinking, to start helping to build the system, try to see how we can do to make the society better, to attract these people back to the country. So I want to say that's happening is in every developing country, I would say so.
Quick comment?
I was hoping this panel might be filmed. My experience in all these great countries, but strictly from a different side, to be honest with you. My experience goes back 50 years, and this current is last month. And you've done the best job I've heard any group do on those nations as a group. And it's wonderful for us to hear it here, but it's almost selfish. I would hope that maybe that could be expanded a bit. So thank you.
Well, thank you all very, very much. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, great.
Appreciate it.
Great job.
Thank you.
It was a pleasure.
Great job, Bob.
Thank you.
Very nice.
Sorry.
Thank you, Richard.